So in today's video, I'm going to show you a really simple method for painting watercolor bouquets in Procreate. First, we're just going to go through and basically paint 3 different types of loose flowers. And then after that, I'll show you how to combine them together into a bouquet like this. The technique here is pretty beginner friendly, and I'll list all the brushes I'm using in the description below. So the first step in this process is of course to paint all the flowers. And this bouquet is just going to have 3. And to make this video easier for you to follow along, I've already made some sketches and a color palette that you can download in the description as well. Now to use this color palette, all we have to do is just do a long press to grab the color, and we're going to start with this yellow tone. For the brush, I'm going to use the smooth dry round, and I'm just going to rough out these petals just like this. And these are pretty abstract, so all my brush strokes are going to be a little bit scratchy. And that looks pretty good. Now my sketch here is a little bit dark, it's kind of distracting, so I'm going to reduce the transparency of the sketch just to make it lighter, but I can still just barely see it. And then continuing with the flower, I'm going to add the center, so I'll do a long press to grab those colors. I'm going to use this same brush, just at a smaller size, and I'll just kind of dab this around in the middle. And if you want, you can give it more contrast by darkening one side, so I'll just choose a darker color, and I'll just add it in like this. Next, I'll do the stem, and it's just this sort of medium olivey green tone. For the brush, I'm going to use the medium quill at a pretty small size, and I'll just draw it on like this. And then for the leaves, I'll use the same brush again, but I'll just lighten the color a tiny bit. And at this point, this flower could be done, but I want to show you a trick that'll make areas like this a little bit more interesting. So first, I need to turn on alpha lock. So I'll tap on the flower layer, then turn on alpha lock. Next, I need to choose a really soft and fluffy brush. And because I have alpha lock switched on, this I won't be able to paint in the white area. I can only paint on the flower itself, so it just sort of limits it like that. So what I'm going to do is choose a darker, kind of bluer green tone. And I'm just going to dust this on at these intersections with the stem and the leaf. And it's just going to make this a little bit more contrasty. And if some of it gets onto the petals, I think it's fine because it has a nice look. And now that flower number 1 is finished, we can move on to the next one. So I'll turn off that layer, and I'll turn off the sketch as well. I'll turn on the sketch for flower number 2. I'll set the opacity so I can barely see it, and then I'll start painting it again on a blank layer down here. And I'll start with this kind of pink tone. And for the brush, I'll use the smooth dry round again. And I'll paint these by basically creating a sort of a U shape like this. And then I'll scribble back and forth to fill in the inside. After that, I want to make each flower kind of fade to a purple tone. So to do that, I'll grab the freehand selection tool. I'll just select all the bases of the flowers at once. I'll feather it out around 20%. Hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll try to find that purple tone. Then I'll darken it, adjust the saturation, and I think that looks good enough. And this time, I'm going to do the insides of the flowers on a separate layer because there's a little trick I want to show you. So I'll make another layer. I'll grab this inside color, and I'm going to do those using the scratchy dry round. And I'll use it kind of at a medium size and just tap it around like this. And the reason I did this on its own layer is because I want to erase it a little bit. And what I'm going to do is sort of erase it as if there's a petal in the front sort of covering it up. So for example, I'll just kind of clear it out like this. And this one, I'll do each one different. After that, I want to lighten the original flowers we painted just in those areas, just to make it look like there's another petal. So I'll make sure that layer is selected. Again, I'll grab the freehand selection tool, and I'll just trace out the outline of where that petal might be. There we go. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just kind of adjust those areas so they're a little bit lighter and a little bit desaturated, just so they stand off a tiny bit. And if I turn off the sketch, I think you can see this a little bit better. I just wanted to create a sort of layered effect. After that, I'll move on and do the stems and the leaves. And I'm going to do these basically the same way I did for the last flower. I'll just use the medium quill brush for the stems, and this time I think I'll use the rough quill to do the leaves. And just to make sure the leaves don't all end up looking the same, I'll slightly shift the color for each one. Now in this area where the leaf is overlapping the stem, you could kind of leave that as it is, but I recommend blending it. So I'm going to switch to the water blender, and I'll just go in there at a pretty small size and just go back and forth until it disappears. And these could be done, but there's two more kind of finishing touches I want to do. First, I want to lighten all the ends of the flowers. So to do that, I'll grab the freehand selection tool and just select the ends. Again, I'll feather it out around 20%. Hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll just brighten it a bit and then shift it towards orange. And the other thing I wanted to do is blend the kind of point here where the stem touches the flower. So to do that, I need to switch on Alpha Lock. Then I'll make sure I've got my water blender selected. And I'll just go in there and pull some of the stem color into the flower. And these flowers are finished, but if you remember earlier, I did the centers of the flowers on a separate layer. So before I move on, I want to merge them all together. After that, I'll make a new layer, turn off these flowers, turn on the final sketch, and I'll just fill this one out pretty quickly, just using all the same techniques we discussed so far. And it's optional, but I want to blend the point where the leaf meets the stem, just because it looks a little bit too hard there. So once again, I'll turn on Alpha Lock. I'll grab the water blender, and I'll just soften up each point. And at this point, all the flowers are finished, and we can move on and make the arrangement. However, before we do that, there's kind of a subtle problem here we need to fix. So for example, all the flowers are on separate layers. If I select the pink flowers and I move it over, you can see it's kind of transparent. And that's just because we're using watercolor brushes and there's a lot of transparency going on. So I recommend before moving on and making your arrangement, you should remove all the transparency from the flowers. And it's pretty easy to do that. So to remove the transparency, we need to go through each flower kind of one by one. So I'll turn everything off except flower number 1. And it's pretty easy. I'll just create a duplicate of it. So there's 2 copies here. I'll select the original one. I'll raise the brightness all the way to max. And what this does is it creates a perfectly white copy of our flower, but behind it. I'll make 2 copies, and then I'll merge it together onto one layer. This maintains all the tones and the shades and the colors, but it totally eliminates the transparency. And I'm going to do this process to each flower. And now that we've gone through the process, you can see the results here. If you remember, this flower was kind of transparent, but now it's totally opaque and nothing is showing through it. And at this point, I'm just going to go through and use the arrow tool just to create a nice arrangement. If you want, you can also warp some of the flowers to make them fit better. You can also duplicate them or mirror them. And there we go. I think this looks pretty good. Now, once you're happy with your arrangement, just go ahead and merge all the flowers together onto one layer, and we can do a little bit of editing. So in this case, some of the stems ran long, so I'm just going to erase them back. And I think overall, it's a little bit unbalanced, so I'm just going to use the warp tool to fix that. There we go. And now that the arrangement's finished and I'm happy with how everything looks, I'm going to move on to the last step, which is basically doing a little bit of blending. So to do this blending, I'm going to make sure Alpha Lock is still on, You can tell it's on here because it has this kind of checkerboard effect, and also the effect is checked. Then I'll go straight to the water blender brush. And I'll just go in there and carefully blend some of these more kind of chaotic areas. Once again, because Alpha Lock is switched on, it won't let me go off into the white area, and it keeps all this blending nicely limited to the flowers themselves. And just like that, this bouquet is finished. Now, after going through this technique quite a few times, I've noticed that it's pretty important to keep the individual flowers as simple as possible. I think it's easy to get carried away with adding lots of details, but once you combine them together into the final bouquet, the kind of overwhelming details can be too much. As always, if you think I've earned it, please give this video a like, and here are 2 more watercolor flower tutorials I think you'll love to watch next.